What's up everyone, Tactics Zombies here. With the release of the OG season, I've been playing a ton of Fortnite again this past week, so I thought it'd be really fun to go through and rank all the 20 POIs that are in this first week of OG, from worst to best. Obviously this is just all my personal opinion on how much I like the POIs, and if you have a separate list, which I'm sure you will because there's a lot of POIs, leave it in the comments below so I can see how your guys' lists compare to mine. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and hit that subscribe button. Let me know if I should do another one of these for week 2. Without any further ado, let's get right into the rankings. My least favorite of the POIs this week is gotta be Haunted Hills. Even when it was in the game normally, I was never a huge fan of it. It's kind of unremarkable in my opinion. As much as I like the idea of a creepy crypt graveyard area for a POI, I just don't think it was executed very well here. It's very boring, there's only a couple buildings and they're just like mausoleums. The highlight is the church, which, you know, it's pretty cool, you can get some high ground up there, but again, there's not really a whole lot going on here. I even forgot this was in the game until it came back for OG season. Playing in multiplayer, I think the only team size that could actually land here and do well would be duos. I don't think there'd be enough loot to go around for a trio or squad. Solo maybe, but again, there's just a lot more fun places to land. Like, who goes to Haunted Hills? Like, not me. First time I went here was for this video. I think that the most notable thing that Haunted Hills has ever done has been the backdrop for the Raven loading screen, and that's why it's at number 20. Up at number 19 is Junction. I think this is a pretty decent step up from Haunted Hills, but it's still not good. Best thing it has going for it is obviously a great source of metal. You know, there's cars all around, it's a junkyard, so you can harvest metal here super easily. Honestly, the big reason I never land here is just its location. Like, it is so far out of the way of everything else. It also doesn't help that the only POI that's anywhere close to it is Haunted Hills. It's on the smaller end of the POIs as well, so there's not a whole lot of loot here. Overall, I think you're better off landing anywhere else, just because the amount of loot you get doesn't warrant the trip you're going to have to make to get to Circle, because more often than not, you're going to have to run half the map to get to Circle if you land here. That's just how it goes. Again, I like the junkyard aesthetic, but I just wish they would have put it anywhere else on the map, and that's why it's at number 19. At number 18, we have Lonely Lodge, which, again, I'm not a huge fan of this one. I know people who are, but it's just not for me. Personally, I'm just not a big fan of these foresty POIs. I just never really have been. It doesn't help that for as big of a place Lonely Lodge is, there's not a whole lot of trees compared to Whing Woods, which we'll get to. And the only two real important places are the Lodge and then the Ranger Tower. Aside from that, it's just wasted space in my opinion. I feel like there's generally very little incentive to want to land here, especially considering how far out of the way it is compared to everything else. That's the kicker with a lot of these early spots, is they're very far out of the way. I feel like if a POI is going to be way off on the side of the map like Lonely Lodge is, it really needs something to draw people in, and I think it lacks in that department. I think the most culturally significant thing Lonely Lodge has ever done was that Drake meme from a couple years ago. Aside from that, this is one of my least favorites, and that's why it's just low on the list. And at number 17, we have Whing Woods. I think Whing Woods' biggest problem is that building material capacity is half of what it used to be back in Chapter 1. There's not really any good reason to go so far out of your way to land at Whing Woods to stock up on wood, because you can stock up on wood basically anywhere now that it only takes 500 to hit max. The actual loot here is horrendous. I mean, it's just a little hedge maze with a little bit in the middle. There's maybe 3, 4, 5 chests here if you're lucky, and then some floor loot. Again, this whole list is my personal opinion, and that's the only real reason that Whing Woods made it above Lonely Lodge and the others so far, is just because I have more fond memories here than at any of the places prior. And I'm not saying any of them are bad aside from Haunted Hills, it's just there are so many good POIs this season that it's kind of hard to rank them all like this, because you gotta put some at the bottom, and that's just how these ended up. I'm not saying it's a horrible POI, it's just that there are so many others this season I would rather land at. And that's why it's number 17. And at number 16 is Tomato Temple. I think I would have preferred to see Tomato Town here instead, even though Tomato Town had like 0 loot. I still preferred it over Tomato Temple. Overall, there's really not like a whole lot I have to say about this. I just think it's a very mediocre POI. I think it's a cool idea, but I think if they were going to revamp Tomato Town, they could have revamped it and made it more of a bigger city, instead of just completely destroying it and turning it into Tomato Temple, because again, it's just not my thing. I think for their first attempt at a temple-themed POI, it's a pretty decent attempt, but again, it's just, I really just don't have a lot to say. It's a nothing location for me. I really don't ever go here. Let me put it this way, I never land at Tomato Temple, but I always end up at Tomato Temple, because that's where Circle usually ends up in my experience. So, and I think number 16 is pretty fair. There's a lot of better POIs this chapter, but I would land here over some of the other ones on the list so far. That's why I think it's sitting pretty comfortably at number 16. Number 15, we have Snobby Shores. Now we're starting to get into some of the better locations in my opinion. For starters, I really like the concept of this gated coastal community off on the west side of the map. But that's kind of where my problems come in, is that the 4 houses that are there all feel very similar in my opinion. There is quite a bit of loot here though, especially on solos, because there is 4 big sized houses that are here. I think Snobby Shores is a really good low-key place to drop, especially because not too many people land here usually. Especially on trios or squads, because it's a nice low-key spot and there's still enough loot to go around for a big team like that. I just don't think it stands up there in like the top tier of POIs of some of the other ones this season. Number 14 is Salty Springs, and of the main like town POIs, this is easily my least favorite. I think its location is good, you know, it's very central, it's got other POIs like Dusty Divot right nearby. But I think Salty Springs is just kind of bland compared to the other town POIs. I think it just kind of lacks like a key landmark to really set it apart. I mean, there's like the hill, but I consider that more outside of Salty Springs than actually a part of Salty Springs. You know, there's the gas station, but there are a ton of those all over the map, so that's not really something that is like exclusively Salty Springs. Mind you, I'm not saying Salty Springs is bad, I still think it's a good POI. They're all good POIs from this point forward. But I just think Salty Springs is boring compared to the other town POIs especially, and just the other POIs in general this season. 13 is Lazy Links, and this is another one that I really like, same as like Snobby Shores. I love the whole country club, golf club aesthetic they have going on here. This is a great spot to go if you want to get an ATK this season. You can actually play golf here if you have one of the golf ball emotes. I think this is a pretty cool POI, all things considered. As with a lot of the ones so far, the location isn't the best. You know, it's very far north, but I'd prefer it just be very far north and in the center like it is, than very far north and off in one of the corners like, you know, Junction or Whing Woods. I think this is a pretty middle-of-the-road POI for this week, all things considered. I really don't have a whole lot else to say about Lazy Links, so let's get right into the next one. In at number 12 is Lucky Landing. I was honestly shocked to see it on the map this week because I could have sworn Lucky Landing was only in the game for Season 3. Putting all that aside, I think Lucky Landing is one of the most visually appealing POIs we've ever gotten in Fortnite. I think all the pagodas and the like cherry blossom centerpiece is very unique. I think it makes it a very fun location to be at. Honestly, that's one of the big reasons it made it this high, is just the aesthetics are like nothing else in this season. So that's really what carries it up to this middle-of-the-road ranking. You know, if this were themed like any other Fortnite town, it would definitely be down a couple spots. But the Asian architecture is really what makes Lucky Landing, and that's why it's ranked number 12. Number 11 is Shifty Shafts. I'm a really big fan of the mine setting that they have going on here. I think it's in a great location, you know, it's just south of Tilted Towers. There's a ton of loot here, especially for not being the biggest POI on the map. And enough people land here every game, you know, in my experience, that you'll usually be able to get a couple kills at the start of the game. Fighting other players in the mines is a blast in my opinion, because you can't really rely on building the way you can above ground. This really gives Shifty Shafts a very different feel than a lot of the other POIs, you know? Overall, I think Shifty Shafts is a very good POI. That's the thing, is going forward, each of these POIs are good. We're past the bad and mediocre ones in my opinion. We're going to be kicking off the top 10 with Flush Factory. Now, Flush Factory is a personal favorite of mine because it was the first place I ever landed in Fortnite way back in 2017 when it came out. So I may be a little biased putting it this high, but I think top 10 is pretty fair. You know, the actual concept of a toilet factory is pretty out there and goofy. The loot here is pretty good if you're playing solo or duos, but I don't think I could really recommend landing here on trios or squads. You know, it's just a small POI, so I don't really think there'd be enough loot to go around. As is usually the case, the one thing keeping me from placing it any higher is, of course, the location. You know, it's basically the southwest corner of the map, so it's very far out of the way. And since Flush Factory is so small, it gets pretty repetitive after landing here a couple times in a row. But if you want a nice low-key spot to start your game off at, Flush Factory is always a great option. I feel like Fatal Field sits pretty comfortably at the number 9 spot. Especially since Frenzy Fields was like my main drop spot for a huge portion of Chapter 4, it does feel nice to be landing at Fatal Fields once again. Personally, I always preferred Anarchy Acres, but I'm not going to hold that against Fatal Fields. I think Fatal Fields is still a very fine POI. Fatal Fields is very unique compared to a lot of the other POIs this season. Obviously, since Anarchy Acres is replaced with Lazy Links, it's the only farm on the map right now. This is a good safe to go if you want to get mats or don't want to commit to landing at Whing Woods, which if you don't, I don't blame you. So even though I do think Fatal Fields is very good, there are other POIs that are better than it in my opinion, but that doesn't make Fatal Fields any less good. And at number 8 is Dusty Divot, which I think is a very good POI. You know, I always preferred Dusty Divot over Dusty Depot, because I thought Dusty Depot was just a bit boring. As for location, you can't get any better than this. It's the most centrally located POI on the map. And it's a Season 5 version, so it's very visually interesting. You know, there's the overgrown research station and forest down in the actual Divot, and then like the tourist trap that they built out of the old warehouses. I think it's great. It's super easy to stock up on wood and metal from the forest and then the research station, and then like all the crates in the warehouses, which just means one more reason not to land at Whing Woods. I guess what I'm trying to say is that Dusty Divot is great. That's why I put it at number 8. And at number 7 is Loot Lake. Now, as you know, for the OG season, the water is back to how it was originally, where it's like waist high, but there's no swimming. This makes Loot Lake a pain to traverse because you either have to slog through the water or build floors across, which I think is just a waste of materials. And if that's how Loot Lake still was, it wouldn't even crack the top 10 for me. But the big change that they made that I think makes Loot Lake much better is they added zip lines all across, connecting all the islands with the mainland and with each other. I think this is just a great quality of life improvement overall, and it gives the POI such a better sense of flow than it had originally. And I just think it warrants being up here because Loot Lake is just that iconic. Especially with how much Chapter 4 used Loot Lake, whether it be the island teleporting in like midway through the match, or how Mega City basically had its own version of Loot Lake. I think it just shows that Epic was kind of itching to get back to Loot Lake, get it back in the game. At least that's my theory, and I'm really happy they did because it's one of my favorites. Narrowly missing the top 5 is Tilted Towers, coming in at number 6. I know this might be controversial not having Tilted in the top 5, but hear me out real quick. Obviously there are people who are mad that Tilted Towers doesn't have Trump Tower anymore, instead it's the No Sweat Insurance Building, and I don't really care about that. My thing is that Tilted just doesn't feel as special because they already brought it back in Chapter 3, and that was a big deal, so it's not like the rest of the OG map where this is the first time we've seen a lot of it in forever. Tilted was last in the game like a year and a half ago, so it really hasn't been gone that long in comparison to a lot of the other POIs. Obviously Tilted Towers is still a top tier location, I just don't feel as hyped about it as I do most of the other POIs, and that's why it just barely misses the top 5. Risky Reels is at number 5. This is definitely my favorite of the small POIs that are on the map. You know, I really like the vibe of just the drive-in theater, it's super unique. Risky Reels is also one of my only exceptions to the whole location thing. I really don't think it matters that much just because I like the POI itself so much. Again, I think it's a very unique place, a drive-in theater. You don't really see those very much in video games, so it's cool to have one in Fortnite. All the cars out of here means it's a good source of metal, so if you want to get materials, it's always good to land here. There's enough buildings that have chests in them, so there's a good amount of loot here, plus all the chests that spawn on the actual screen and like around the cars. Risky Reels is just a super well-rounded, really well-executed POI, that's why it's in my top 5. Paradise Palms is at number 4, just because I think it's pretty much just a better Tilted Towers in my opinion. I think it's super unique that it's out in the desert, because it's the only actual named POI there this week. I really like that there's a good variety, you know, there's the hotel, then a couple of stores, and all the houses in the back, so there's a lot of variety as to where you can land here. There's a ton of loot, because it's such a big POI. Normally, for the other locations in the video, I haven't talked about the other unnamed places that are near it, but with the Paradise Palms, there's just so many. Like, there's the Gus racetrack to the north, and then there's the Adobo Village to the south. Like, the desert is just a loaded area of the map is what I'm getting at. There's also usually always people here, so it's always fun to get into fights early game here. So overall, I think Paradise Palms is definitely my favorite of the Season 5 POIs, and just one of the best overall. Starting our top 3 is Retail Row. This is definitely one of the most loaded POIs in the game, with all the stores on the east side, and then you got all the houses on the west. There's a ton of loot here just because there's so many houses and there are so many stores here. The only reason it's at number 3, not 2 or 1, is because the other 2 that are above it I think have a bit more of unique like landmarks at them. Not that it's a huge disservice to Retail Row, mind you, it is still in my top 3, but you know, there's always lots of people here, so it's fun to get into fights. I just wish it had a bit more uniqueness to it, but again, it is a much more unique location and much more fun in my opinion than like Salty Springs or some of the other Season 1 POIs that are in the map right now. Retail Row is still great in my opinion though, and that's why it's cracked the top 3. Taking the silver medal is Pleasant Park. Pleasant Park usually has a ton of people landing there every game, so the early game fights are always a blast. You know, it's right in the middle of a bunch of other POIs like Loot Lake, Pleasant Park, Haunted Hills, etc. But as for the actual POI itself, I think it's really cool. It's a pretty nice area. You know, the actual like park in the middle is pretty pleasant. And I think it's cool how for OG season you can see the time machine from last season is in Pleasant Park. It's in the middle in the soccer field. There's a ton of houses here, so there's a ton of loot just from chest spawns. I mean, Pleasant Park is almost perfect. That's why I was in the game for all of Chapter 2 as well. There's really not a whole lot else I have to say about Pleasant. You guys probably know just as well as I do how fun it is to land here. But it just narrowly misses out on being my favorite POI this week. But by process of elimination, you've probably figured out what my favorite POI this week is. So without any more delay, let's get right into it. Taking the top spot on my ranking is Greasy Grove, and I don't know how controversial this is to say, but it really is my favorite POI on the map this week. I think the Durr Burger is a great landmark for Greasy Grove, and personally, when I think of Fortnite, even to this day, Durr Burger is one of the first things that comes to mind. I also think like the Bass Pro Shops, like the camping and fishing store, super unique. Like, I would not have expected to see that here when I first downloaded Fortnite. People land here, so you always get into fights right away. I just think Greasy Grove is one of the best POIs they've ever made, and it's my personal favorite. And that wraps up the countdown. Obviously, this is my personal opinion, and there's a lot of hot takes in here. Even my friends, I was telling them about the list, they had some pretty choice words for some of my placements. So let me know in the comments below what your ranking would be, or if there are just any particular placements that you agree with or don't agree with, and tell me why. But anyways, if you liked the video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. This is Tactic Zombie signing out. Peace out, and God bless.
Yeah, cause I got it like that. Flow so smooth like I got it on tap. Yeah, and I'ma say it be a good night while I'm on my Yingling, while I'm drinking Bud Light. Can you get it when you miss me?